we should
Okay,
be
no
good to go
problem.
now. Cool. And I'll say on the outset, before Jen even has a chance to welcome anybody, my internet has been a little bit off today. So if you ever see us blip out, we'll come back in a second and it's my fault.
All right. Well, first of all, welcome to our watch party. I guess we can go ahead and get started, unless you want to wait a little bit to let a few people tune in.
Sure. Well, while I see we have like 6 people watching the stream with us right now, we could tell them kind of what our game plan is today and then get started with the first video.
Yeah. Well, and first of all, I'm Jen, Vice President of Kansas Ornithological Society, and Rachel here is emceeing this event and making sure that we're all running smoothly. And so basically what we wanted to give you guys all an opportunity to watch these videos and kind of all in one chunk, almost like what we would do during a normal meeting. But also if you were having trouble finding things, that kind of thing, this is just an easy way to get to it. But also, if you want to have some dialogue with some other folks about the presentations, then you're going to have that opportunity to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. There is a chat on the YouTube, wherever you're watching, you should be able to see the chat. I'll be posting the links to the videos as we watch them if you want to go leave comments directly on their videos if you have any comments or questions. Yeah, anything else?
I don't think so.
All right, well, I'm excited to watch some science.
Yeah, yes, we do have some great presentations that were submitted this year, so excited about that.
I've been specifically not watching them so that I could watch them for the first time today.
So, and who do we have first? I think
Dylan Smith.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So our first presentation is going to be from Dylan Smith with the Kansas State University. And his talk is on the climatic variability explains interannual variation in breeding distributions of grasshopper sparrows.
I'm going to talk to you all today about how climatic variability can explain where grasshopper sparrows choose to breed each year.
Are you able to hear it, Jen?
So first we'll start with a kind of backyard example. Let's say you have robins that breed nest in your yard every year. You might find yourself wondering whether these are the same robins that are coming back every year, whether they're being site faithful, or if they're different robins every year that just happen to be breeding in your yard. For some species and some systems.
Sorry, are you able to hear it, Jen?
Yes, actually. Yep, sorry.
Okay, good. No, it's okay. I just was making sure it was going through on their end. Okay.
This is a pretty easy answer. In shrubland and forest birds, they're pretty site faithful. They tend to return to the same place every year. And this is largely determined by their nest success. So if they're successful in a given spot in a given year, they're likely to come back to that same spot. And this makes sense because this way they can kind of save on energy. They don't have to waste a lot of energy to find a new place to breed every year. But this doesn't seem to be true for birds in every system. So in grasslands, for example, grassland birds tend to have much lower site fidelity. It can be as low as 2% in some species like spring pipits. And this generally does not seem to be due to nest success. So even if they're successful in a given year, they won't necessarily return to the same place next year. And so what we want to know is kind of if they're not making these decisions based on nest success, and if they're not necessarily returning to the same place, where are they going and why? And to answer this question, we focused on a single species, on grasshopper sparrows, which are a really common breeding species in the Great Plains. And we know that they have a high propensity for dispersal, so they're really likely to kind of move around. And we also have data from a single site from Conser Prairie that shows that abundance varies greatly between years. So this kind of, one of the common explanations for why grasshopper birds have low site fidelity is because of habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. And so if there's this much variation at a single site, this kind of suggests that there's at least something else going on because the habitat at this single site isn't changing that much between years. And so we wanted to know what else might be causing this high amount of difference in abundance between years for grasshopper sparrows. One potential explanation is weather. I'm sure a lot of you are aware the Great Plains are really climatically variable. One day it can be really cold and rainy, next day it can be really hot and sunny. And there's also a lot of variation between years. And we think this interannual variation in weather might be affecting where Grasshopper Sparrows choose to breed, because if the same site isn't going to be the same every year, it makes sense not to come back to it. And we know that weather does affect them at some parts of their annual cycle. So their overwinter survival, they winter in Mexico and southern United States, and their overwinter survival is pretty low for grasshopper birds. And it's largely determined by weather. So you can see on this graph, the survival probability goes down as the weekly minimum temperature goes down. So the colder it is, the more birds die. And so we know weather does affect them at some parts of their annual cycle, but we want to know how it affects them at other parts. And so we had a few main hypotheses for this. The first, related to that last slide, is mortality. If birds die over the winter, they obviously can't return to grasshopper birds because they're dead. And it's largely determined by, because of this, we hypothesized that there'd be lower abundance on the breeding grounds when the temperatures on the winter grounds are lower, because there aren't as many birds to return. It can also affect them directly via movement decisions. So for this, birds choose whether to settle based on the climatic conditions during migration. And so it might be cheaper for them to go somewhere else rather than to stay in subpar conditions. And so for this, we predicted that there'd be lower abundance when the temperatures on the breeding grounds are lower in April during migration. It could also affect birds indirectly, also through movement decisions. So for this hypothesis, birds choose whether to settle in a given spot based on the vegetation structure and the vegetation phenology, the timing of the vegetation growth. And for this, we predict that there'll be lower abundance when precipitation in the preceding year's growing season is lower or is higher, because that would lead to more vegetation growth, or when the growing season started later, because they have more information about what conditions will be like during the breeding season. And so throughout this talk, I'll keep using these colors and these symbols to represent these three hypotheses. So we took these three hypotheses and we collected data from 2008, 2018, so for a full decade across the entire Great Plains. We collected Grasshopper Sparrow abundance data from eBird. So if you've submitted an eBird checklist with a Grasshopper Sparrow in it in the Great Plains in the last decade, you contributed to this project. We also collected climatic data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, and land cover data from the North American Land Change Monitoring System, which is a combination of Canadian, American, and Mexican land change monitoring systems. And once we had all this data, we summarized all this into 400 individual grid cells that are 100 square kilometers in size each across the whole Great Plains. And you can kind of see an example of what that looks like on this graph to the right. So each of those little squares is a single grid cell. And once we had all these data and all these data summarized to the same resolution, we fit models of these data, shown as additive models with a negative binomial distribution. And to see what that looks like, we'll kind of blow up a single cell and we'll see all the different data that goes into the model for each cell. And so you can see this single cell has 100 kilometers per side. We have our response variable, which is just the abundance of Grasshopper Sparrows during the breeding season from May to July. We have different other variables to account for potential bias in eBird data. So for example, we have the proportion of developed land, because we know eBird checklists are more common in places that are more developed, near cities or near roads. We also include the number of eBird checklists submitted in that cell. So this is kind of get at the popularity of a given spot, because more birds will be birding and potentially reporting sparrows in places that are more popular. We also included the number of hotspots with more than 10 observations. And again, this is to get at the idea of popularity. So birds might be drawn to hotspots that are really popular. We also include the number of observers. This is kind of another measure of how popular a place is. So places with more observers will have more checklists and potentially see more sparrows, whether there are actually more or not. And lastly, we include spatial autocorrelations. This is basically the idea that if one cell has a lot of sparrows, it's likely that the ones around it will too. So we want to account for that so that we can get a picture of where sparrows are breeding across the entire Great Plains. And then lastly, we had our main predictor variables. So these are kind of the variables that we're using to determine which of those hypotheses is correct. and the start date of the growing season in the current year as via the date of the last frost. That's kind of when plants start growing. And so we have three main models to determine which one of these hypotheses seems to be driving where birds are breeding. And once we fit those models and determine the top model using AIC, we found that our top model suggests that the start date of the growing season in the previous year's precipitation had the strongest effect on where grasshopper sparrows breed. And so this suggests that weather's strongest effects are indirect and likely through vegetation. So birds aren't necessarily selecting a place based on the weather conditions there. They're selecting based on vegetation, which is then influenced by weather. And interestingly, this means that last year's weather is actually the strongest predictor. So they're not choosing based on conditions while they're migrating. They're choosing based on conditions from the previous year. So there's these lag effects. And so I have this graph. I'll try and explain it really fast. The x-axis is the start date of the growing season. The y is the amount of precipitation in the preceding year. And the color is the expected relative abundance of grasshopper sparrows. So the redder a spot on this graph is, the more sparrows are likely to breed in a given place, and the bluer, the fewer. So you can kind of see there's this little sweet spot here where sparrows tend to prefer sites where the start of the growing season is before March and where last year's precipitation was lower. And so to kind of summarize all this, last year's weather effects seem to be stronger than conditions when these birds are arriving. So even if conditions when they arrive don't seem great, that doesn't matter. What matters is what the conditions were like the year before. And maybe wondering why, who cares? Why does all this matter? Grassland birds are declining more than birds of any other habitat group. You can see in this graph, over half of all grassland birds have been lost since 1970, as opposed to like 30 to 10% for other habitat groups. And understanding where these birds go and where they breed and why will help us with conservation, because we'll know where the best places to conserve are and what will predict where birds will be. And with that, if you have any questions, I guess post them in the comments below. And I want to thank all my lab mates and all the sparrows that gave me some data. Thank you.
That was awesome. I'm going to leave the ending screen up here for a second, just so that if you guys want to write down any of Dylan's information, you can grab it. And I see that Dylan is actually answering questions in the chat right now, so that's awesome.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Dylan. And very interesting information.
So for those of you who don't have access to the comments, it might be cool to read out what these questions are. Yeah, so Malcolm had asked about the block of data. 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers is a big block, and wondered if that was restricted by the data availability. So Dylan said it was selected because that's the resolution at which precipitation varies, and that's the weather variable that varies over the smallest area. So that's really cool. Dylan also says that brood parasitism would be cool to look at, but unfortunately they don't have a great way to measure brood parasitism across the whole Great Plains. Yeah, except maybe by presence, abundance of cowbirds, which maybe would be a good indicator. But I don't know. I just watched Sarah's presentation on cowbirds not too long ago, and it sounds like there's a lot of variables in how they respond to their nest being parasitized.
Yes, that was a very interesting talk as well. So yeah, good questions.
And I guess this data was eBird data, so yeah, it's that's such a cool thing too. I love seeing citizen science doing actual science.
Awesome.
Cool.
All right.
I'll stop sharing this screen. And let me figure out which video is next. We're going to listen to Jacquelyn's next.
Gotcha.
Jen.
Okay. So the next one, we can get to it here. Okay. So this is another student from Kansas State University, and it's Jacquelyn Gehrt. And she will be presenting on the Greater Prairie-chicken habitat selection within a mosaic burning regime on Fort Riley Military Reservation.
Hi everyone, thank you for attending my talk today. I will be discussing Greater Prairie-chicken habitat selection on Fort Riley Military Reservation, just a tidbit of my master's research. Greater Prairie-chickens are currently in decline. They are limited to mixed grass and tall grass prairies. Their populations have declined 75 to 80% from historic levels. And this is largely attributed to habitat loss and conversion of land, as well as land mismanagement. However, in Kansas, we currently have one of the largest remaining populations of Greater Prairie chickens. So we have about 79,000 birds left in the state, and most of which are centered around the Flint Hills ecoregion. The land in the Flint Hills isn't lucrative for cultivation because of the rocky soil, so this may be a saving grace for Greater Prairie chickens because they still have remaining grasslands. However, there are some contemporary ranching practices that pose issues for these birds. And these issues include things like intensive grazing, so overstocking, as well as annual burning, which doesn't leave a lot of habitat on the landscape for Greater Prairie chickens. However, there is an area within the Flint Hills that doesn't allow grazing, and this is the Fort Riley Military Reservation. Fort Riley also implements a burn mosaic management style, as seen here, which I will get to in a little bit. The question that I'd like to answer during this talk is, if Greater Prairie chickens aren't subject to the intensive burning and grazing found on many private lands in Kansas, what habitat types will they select? Getting into my study area a little bit, Fort Riley encompasses 41,000 hectares of land, 29,000 of which are used for wildlife management. Prescribed burns are implemented on the reservation at various frequencies, along with the occasional wildfire due to military activity. If you look at the bottom picture on the screen, you'll see this is Fort Riley outlined. However, Fort Riley is broken up into little squares that each have a different shade of gray. And this shade of gray corresponds to the frequency of burn. So the lighter the shade of gray, the more frequently that area is burned on Fort Riley. Some of my methods for this project, we captured Greater Prairie chickens on the reservation from early March to late April using walk-in traps. There were some times during the study where these chickens just did not want to cooperate. And as you see in this picture of the road, there are some traps set up on the road because these birds just would not want to leck in the grass. Instead, they lecked on the road. So we, by golly, pounded our rebar and traps into the road to catch them. We were pretty successful, so in 2019 we caught 22 females, and in 2020 we caught 16 females. Each female was outfitted with a GPS satellite transmitter, which allowed us to get locations of these birds during the breeding season. We also conducted vegetation surveys. We conducted them at nest locations, used locations by the birds, and at random locations across the landscape to get an idea of what was available to these chickens. At each survey, burn frequency was noted. So going back to my question, I was particularly interested in the habitat types that were selected during the lekking season, the nesting season, at used locations, and at nest locations. So giving you a little background to start off with, this was a study conducted out of Oklahoma State, and it describes the overall habitat selection of greater prairie chickens throughout the breeding season. So in the lekking season, birds chose these really short grass areas to lek in. However, during the nesting season, these birds selected for areas with denser vegetation with more structure to provide concealment for their nests. Getting into my results a little bit, starting off with the lekking season habitat selection, I looked up the probability of use of different fire frequencies on the landscape. So on this x-axis, you see the fire frequencies at a 16-year average. So as a reference, a fire frequency of 0.5 would mean that an area is burned every 8 out of 16 years or every other year. And a frequency greater than that means it's burned more often. So we see here that during the lekking season, these chickens selected for areas that were frequently burned in both 2019 and 2020. The same trend is seen during the nesting season. So these birds selected for high frequency burned areas. Getting into more of these spatial components, I conducted a hotspot analysis on GIS. So these hotspots or areas of frequent use are represented by these boxes in this map, and then the map is overlaid by different seasonality of burns. So which season of which year were areas burned. And we see between these two maps that locations are pretty similar on the landscape. So they're in similar areas. However, the burn seasonality between the two maps differs. So 2019 burn used areas that were burned in fall of 2017, so about a year and a half before the study took place. However, birds in 2020 selected for areas that were burned in fall of 2019, so like 6 months or less from when they were using that area during the breeding season. The same is true for the nesting season. We see similar locations in similar places on the landscape. However, that burn mosaic or burn frequency shifted between years. Getting into specific location uses, we see that for use locations, birds selected for areas that were burned every 1 to 2 years and selected against areas that were burned every 2 years or more. And the same is true for nest locations. These birds selected for areas that were burned every 1 to 2 years, so very frequently. And they selected against these areas with less frequent burns, which would provide more cover. So that was interesting. To provide you with some more context of where these locations were on the landscape, here's a map of 2019 nest and lek locations, and then 2020 nest and lek locations. Again, they're in similar places on the landscape between years. It's just that burn mosaic, so the time since burn shifted between years. And below, here are some tables that show the total number of nests that were located in each time interval of burn, the number of successful nests, and then the apparent survival rate between the 2019 and 2020 nests. So despite birds selecting for similar locations on the landscape to place their nests, the areas in which they placed their nests really determined their survival. So birds that placed their nests in areas that were burned 1 to 2 years only had a 9% survival estimate, whereas birds that placed their nest in locations burned every 2 to 4 years had a 21% survival estimate. So what does this mean? Overall, birds selected for habitats that were frequently burned. However, we did see a difference in yearly selection. So in 2019, they selected a little less strongly for these frequently burned areas. And some reasons why this could be is because there was a lot more precipitation in 2019, so maybe these birds were choosing to stay put to decrease their chances of being predated. Or maybe these variations in years were due to the variation in burn mosaic. So although the locations on the landscape were similar that the birds selected for, the time since burn differed quite a bit between years. The same is true for nest locations. So they were consistent on the landscape, the locations were, but the changing burn mosaics between years led to differences in survival of nests. And overall, this means that birds seem to select for location on the landscape rather than time since burn. So they select for specific locations instead of like vegetation structure. And this may lead to differences in survival rates. So we saw that with nest locations, and this could be true for survival. So it's really crucial that we have the proper burn intervals to allow the greatest chance of survival for these birds. Because it'd be pretty sad to end up like this little guy, and we'd much rather see birds alive and well, and allow these birds to persist on the landscape. So burn intervals and burn regimes are really important to manage for, especially in Kansas, to keep these birds persisting into the future. And with that, I would like to thank quite a few people here. My technicians were great, my lab mates were great, as well as Alan Hynek, Sean Stratton, and Derek Moon out of Fort Riley, as they were the leaders on the Fort Riley side of projects and allowed me a lot of information and have been super helpful along the way. So thank you.
Cool. Well, that was awesome. I'm going to go ahead and post her email in the comments here in the chat.
Yeah.
So that way, if you want to send her a note or some questions, it's right there for you.
So. Okay, and it looks like Malcolm has a question. So Jackie, if you are on, he wants to know if you're watching, what your takeaways for the Fort Riley property are on this project.
That's a good question. Oh, she is here.
Yay!
Very good. Well, that's exciting. So maybe we can let people ask Jackie their questions directly then. And that's exciting. I love that the presenters are here to talk to people directly.
So especially these K-State kids when there's a football game coming on. So we appreciate you choosing to join us this afternoon.
Cool, more questions. Ooh, there's some good questions popping up. I am realizing now, though, that we've gotten through 2 presentations in half an hour.
We've got a ways to go. So we'll let them continue and probably start on our next one. And we have Luke Headings coming up next. And Luke is from Pittsburgh State University, and he's presenting the evaluating the avian and vegetative communities of mineland wildlife areas in Cherokee and Crawford counties.
Hello, everyone. in the forests of Missouri and the tall grass prairies of eastern Kansas here, which puts us on the very edge of a few species western ranges, such as prothonotary warblers, Kentucky warblers, and Bell's vireos. The other thing about this area that is unique is the geology. About 60% of these two counties is underlaid with shallow coal reserves. So because of that, starting in the 1860s all the way through 1974, they were surface mined. And this was primarily done with these large drag lines, as in the picture here. This is Big Brutus, which at its construction was the second largest drag line in the world and is capable of clearing overburden from a square mile per year. So this mining resulted in pits and lines of overburden that were 60 to 100 feet tall and deep. And it resulted in an extremely, extremely disturbed landscape. So this is what some of those mined areas look like currently. In the foreground here is a pretty characteristic area of the forested sections with lots and lots of strip pits all parallel to each other. And then in the background, we see another type of habitat type that is common on the mined land wildlife areas, which is more of a grassland to shrubland area with the larger pits in them. So the mined land wildlife areas consist of 47 separate wildlife areas, totaling 14,500 acres. 4,000 of those acres are grasslands, 9,000 are shrubby forests. In all but 2,000 acres of the property was at one point strip mined. And because of the mining went from one area to another, there's a very wide range of successional stages in the mined land wildlife areas, from newly reclaimed grasslands to mature forests. And because they were left to natural succession in most cases, the vegetative community is heavily dominated by invasive species. Some of the most common species we are seeing are bush and vine honeysuckle, Serratia lespidosa, autumn olive, and black locust. Some of the current management practices on these areas is pretty standard. They do prescribed burns, native grass restorations. They manage water levels on some of the wetlands that have been put in here, and they also lease out some of these areas for livestock grazing. And some of the difficulties for restoration and management is the terrain. Because there's so many pits and so many overburden piles, it's hard to restore those back to what they should be. And also the soil quality is extremely poor because of the mining process. The soil horizons all got mixed up, and most of this mining was done before a lot of restrictions were implemented, so a lot of the soil is very acidic and not great to grow anything on. So some of the bird populations in this area, like many other places in the state, and those species were identified through several different characteristics. Some of those being if they are state or federally listed, if they are a high conservation value to the state. So if by managing for that species, we're also increasing the amount or the habitat quality for other species, or if it's an indicator species, they will be put on this swap list. And also if it's a regionally endemic species, it may be placed on the swap list. And for our methods, we're monitoring populations and densities through point counts, and we're also going to do some nest searching and monitoring. So this pilot season, we identified 67 different sampling locations throughout 3 habitat types on the mined land wildlife areas. And those three habitat types are the grasslands, forests, and rangeland. So the rangeland is where they've been leasing out the wildlife areas to local ranchers to graze their cattle. And we did our nest searching and monitoring all near our sampling sites according to the bee-bird protocol. And we took basic vegetation data at each sample site and at each nest. So here we have a map of our sampling locations. Our grassland locations are designated by the yellow dots, rangeland by the blue, and forest by the green. And we identified each site primarily by its accessibility. Again, going back to the picture we saw of the minelands, many of the, especially the forested areas, are hard to access because there are so many pits that are filled with water. It is just hard to access the interior of these areas. So we went out and visited each individual wildlife area and determined how accessible they would be, and then laid a grid down and did some random point selection for our sample sites. So for our primary findings for point counts, I'm going to focus on our swap species here. We did find dick thistles were our most common species overall for all species sampled, followed by Bell's vireos, eastern wood pewee, and bobwhites for the swap species. But I'd like to call notice to the prothonotary warbler and the Kentucky warbler were both found in the areas with more of those water-laden pits. Those two species are more reliant on areas with mature forests and lots of water. And I'd also like to note that we did find black-necked stilts and yellow-throated warblers and willow flycatchers in these areas as well. And then for our nest monitoring, we located a total of 48 active nests this summer, 11 of which produced healthy fledglings. And it was very exciting to find 16 Bell's vireo nests, which is encouraging for the next 2 years of our research to get some good data from them. And for our primary vegetation statistics, nothing too surprising here. We found the forest to be the most dense in every category, had the most shrub cover, the densest understory, and the most canopy cover. In our grasslands, the average grass height averaged over 200% taller than on the rangelands, which was a little surprising. And we'd like to look at some of the influences that has on grassland bird obligate species. And then for our rangelands, we saw that they had the least amount of cover in every category that we measured. So the livestock on those is keeping the vegetation back. So for our initial takeaways, we found that the mineland wildlife areas are providing habitat for a very wide range of species. During our sampling season this summer, we saw 74 different species during the breeding season, which included 15 different species of concern for the state. And we also found that the vegetation communities are being heavily influenced by the invasive species that are present here. So moving on to the next 2 years, we would like to expand our data collection to some of the unmined areas adjacent to these wildlife areas for comparison, and to really see if the invasive species are having any adverse effect for individual species. And we'd like to build some habitat and population modeling data. And we are also going to focus our nest monitoring on Bell's vireos and other swap species and ignore some of the more common species like northern cardinals and indigo buntings. So I'd like to acknowledge Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the State Wildlife Grants Program, Pittsburgh State University, and my advisors, Dr. George and Dr. Brodsky. And that is my email down at the bottom there. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear you. You can either email me or leave them in the comments section below, and I'll get back to you just as soon as I can. Thank you for tuning in today.
All right. That was awesome. I'm learning
Yes.
so much.
Yeah, so, and that's kind of my neck of the woods, so I'm pretty familiar with where he's been studying. It's pretty cool that they're doing some work in the minelands areas.
Yeah. I just put Luke's email in the chat, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing this video. Get back to Jen's lovely face.
Yeah, Ike's with us today or not, but hopefully you guys can chat with him some more later about that. And the swap program that he's talking about, that's something you can find some information on the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism website. And so it gives you all the species of concern they're talking about. So very cool.
That's awesome.
All right, well, we'll continue on with our next presenter, and that's Katy Silber, also from the Kansas State University Biology Department. And she is going to be presenting on the apparent survival is correlated with lagged precipitation in a mobile grassland songbird.
Hi, thank you for joining me for my virtual presentation. My name is Katy Silber, and I'm a PhD student at Kansas State University. I study grassland songbird population dynamics, and today I will be sharing a little bit about my research with grasshopper sparrows. So to start out, the system that I work in is the native tallgrass prairie of the Flint Hills. And not only is it a beautiful place to work, but it's really unique in that every time you're out there, it looks a little bit different. So depending on the year or the season or even the day, you might be looking at an entirely different landscape. And we usually attribute this to the three main drivers of grassland systems, which are fire, grazing, and precipitation. So fire and grazing, we can usually control the frequency and intensity, but for precipitation, it is really unpredictable. So it varies within seasons, and among years. So the species who live in these systems, they have to use different strategies to respond to these environmental conditions. So whether you're a plant or an animal, you might respond at the individual level by altering your physiological processes or behavior, or you might respond at the population level by having different abundance in different years. And birds in particular are really flexible in their responses to climatic variability and unpredictability. So all of these are species that you find out on the prairie, and some of them move to different sites each year to seek out the conditions that are favorable for them. And then some species like grasshopper sparrows will move around among different years, but they'll also move around within the same season. And because of these behaviors, we see this really fascinating pattern in that interannual abundance is really variable. And we'd like to know why this is. So let's take 1 year in particular, let's say 1991. Why was there such low abundance this year? Well, maybe the previous year they had really low nest survival, or maybe there were a lot of adult mortalities, or maybe there were a lot of individuals who were there the previous year who decided to go somewhere else to breed in 1991. And for grasshopper sparrows, they are highly mobile. So depending on the site, anywhere between 0 and 80% of individuals return each year. And at our site, this is about 20%. So because of this, we cannot differentiate between deaths and an individual moving out of the population. We actually have to combine these two into a term called apparent survival. So apparent survival is true survival plus site fidelity. So did an individual survive, and did it return to the same site it bred at last year? So if we know that precipitation is really variable, and we know that apparent survival is variable, are these two linked? And if so, when is precipitation important, and how is precipitation important? So to answer this question, we need to come up with some alternative hypotheses. So for example, precipitation might directly increase adult mortalities. We know from previous work that conditions on their wintering grounds influence how many individuals survive over the winter. So if this were the strongest factor in apparent survival, we would expect winter precipitation to be correlated with apparent survival. Alternatively, precipitation might directly influence an individual's decision to settle at a site each year. So maybe in May, when they're returning and deciding where to set up their territory for the breeding season, they might be directly influenced by the conditions at that time. So if precipitation is directly influencing settlement decisions, then we would expect May precipitation to be correlated with apparent survival. Or maybe precipitation is acting over a longer time period. So maybe the conditions that an individual experiences when they're migrating in the fall and the spring, and what they see when they come back, influence their decision of where to settle. Alternatively, maybe precipitation is acting indirectly through habitat characteristics. So maybe precipitation influences the vegetation structure and the prey abundance, which then influences where an individual decides to settle. And if this is the case, we might expect spring precipitation or the precipitation at the start of the growing season to be correlated with apparent survival. Or maybe precipitation over a longer period affects these habitat characteristics. So maybe precipitation from 1 or 2 years prior is influencing the way the landscape looks and is then influencing these settlement decisions. So to answer this question, we have 7 years of data from Konza Prairie, which is in northeastern Kansas. And as you can see in the picture on the right, we put these color bands on individuals so we can tell them apart. We know who returns each year and where they're going. So we use these capture and recite data from banded grasshopper sparrows, and we can also collect weather data from the breeding and wintering grounds using 2 data sources, PRISM and NOAA, and then we sum the local precipitation for each of these predicted time periods. So we can look at this also in terms of a grasshopper sparrow's annual cycle. So for our death hypothesis, we summed the precipitation over the winter period. For our settlement decision hypothesis, we summed precipitation in May and then also over the previous biological year. And for habitat characteristics, we summed precipitation in spring and then in the 2 breeding seasons prior. And what we've found is actually apparent survival is correlated with precipitation 2 years prior. For those of you who are interested in the modeling process, I'd be happy to talk about this a little bit more another time. But essentially, we took the capture histories from the banded individuals and we ran them through Program Mark and ranked the models using AIC. But this is a really fascinating result because grasshopper sparrows on average only live about 3 years. So it's incredible that precipitation over such a long period is correlated with their apparent survival. So if we revisit these alternative hypotheses, with lag precipitation, we can already eliminate these other direct hypotheses. So are there links between precipitation and apparent survival? Yes. And precipitation is important 2 years ago. So how is precipitation important? And to answer this question, let's think about what's important to a grasshopper sparrow. When a male grasshopper sparrow returns to breed for the year, what are they looking for in their habitat? Well, they need some tall perches so they can survey their territory and make sure there are no other males invading. They also need some short grass or bare ground so they can find the food they need. They also need some really dense grasses so they can build a nest. So overall, they need really varied plant structure in a relatively small amount of space. What kind of precipitation from 2 breeding seasons prior creates these conditions? And the answer is we don't know yet. So we've done the first part where we found out when precipitation is important. And now we are applying different precipitation metrics at the 2-year lag to figure out how precipitation is important. So we're thinking about broad-scale climatic cycles like El Nino. We're thinking about regional precipitation, so maybe it's not just at the local site, but since they move around a lot, maybe a regional precipitation is more influential. We're also incorporating extreme weather events like drought and heavy precipitation. So stay tuned. But we do have some main takeaways so far from this work. The most obvious one is that grasshopper sparrows and many other birds are declining. And this is really difficult for those of us who care about birds fine if we didn't have long-term studies. And so in order to start answering these questions, we need to have good long-term data. And finally, precipitation matters. A lot of studies focus on temperature as a main driver of populations, but precipitation is also really influential. So we need to make sure that we include these lines of questioning as well. So finally, I would like to thank my lab mates and all of the undergrads and field techs that worked really hard to collect these data, and of course, the funding sources that made all of this possible. So unfortunately, I can't directly take any questions right now, but if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop them below, or you can send me an email or connect with me on Twitter. Thanks.
Great. I'm putting Katy's contact info in the comments. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if Katy was able to join us today, but really excellent presentation. Some important information to glean later. So hopefully if you guys have any questions, you're able to contact her directly. All right, are we ready for our next one?
Yes, let's go.
Okay. All right, so next up we have Emily Ostrow, and she's from the University of Kansas. And her presentation is on the great horned owl diversity in the Americas and in Kansas.
Cool.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining me today. My name is Emily Ostrow, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kansas working with Rob Moyle. And I want to talk with you today about a few projects I'm working on within my dissertation, focusing on great horned owls and their diversity throughout their range and specifically in Kansas. Before I start, I would like to thank the Kansas Ornithological Society for giving me the opportunity to share my work today and providing me with the funding to make the second part of this talk and the third chapter of my thesis possible. So today I'm going to talk about a bird that many of us are familiar with, the great horned owl. But one thing that I actually didn't realize as someone moving from the East Coast moving to Kansas is that there are a great diversity of plumage and size differences in this species that you don't necessarily appreciate only living in one area. The left image here shows much of that diversity in the different populations of great horned owls. In the front, you have the darkest population, subspecies pacificus, from the Pacific Northwest. And in the back, second from the end, you have the lightest variation, the subspecies subarcticus, compared with the snowy owl in the background. Now, this species is found throughout the Americas, but is particularly contiguous in North America. It becomes patchy as you get into South America. In fact, the owl in the southern part of this range is sometimes considered its own species, Bubo Magellanicus. This is based mainly on vocal differences, but there are plumage differences as well. Now, this group has been characterized extensively morphologically, notably by Bob Dickerman, but minimal genetic work has been completed on this group. Throughout the entire range, 15 subspecies have been described solely on morphological differences. We know, however, that nocturnal birds rely more on calls than plumage differences to recognize one another. So a genetic characterization of the species is important because plumage might not always be accurate in indicating the populations and subspecies described within the species. In fact, the only genetic work done on this species shows no relationships based on subspecies or geographic area, but this was completed with only one mitochondrial gene. So today I want to talk with you about this group, looking at multiple scales, taking a broad, range-wide approach to look for any population structure in this species, and then zooming in on a really cool contact zone between two subspecies in Kansas. Now, before we get into results, I want to tell you a little bit about the way this study was set up. We requested samples from throughout the range of the great horned owl. This sampling scheme also includes at least one individual from each named subspecies. These genetic data I'm about to show you are based on thousands of genetic markers across the genome for the nuclear data and all genes in the mitochondrial genome for the mitochondrial data. This dashed red line here shows the expected split between what we know as the great horned owl and this potential new species in South America, the Magellanic horned owl. Now, I know that the labels on the coming results are small, so the North American group here will be outlined in blue, and the South American group will be outlined in yellow. Here are the results based on the thousands of markers in the nuclear data. Now, if you're not familiar with phylogenetic trees, the important thing to look for is if individuals form a group and how long the branches between groups or individuals are. The longer the branches, the more distantly related two individuals or groups are. So let's look at this tree based on geography. Here I've highlighted the northern group in blue and the southern group in yellow. Everything in between is gray on the map. The two main takeaways are that the southern group is in fact its own group and also quite different from the rest of the Central and North American taxa. This looks good for Bubo magellanicus being its own species. Another interesting result is that the branch lengths between the individuals in North America are quite shallow, which indicates that there might not be a lot of genetic difference between, say, an owl in Pennsylvania and one in Florida. But the nuclear tree is just part of the story. As you may remember from biology class, nuclear genes are inherited from both parents, whereas mitochondria are inherited solely from the mother. By using a mixture of nuclear and mitochondrial sources, we can learn more from the species than by using one alone. This tree, split by geography, on the surface looks quite a bit similar to the nuclear tree, which is a good sanity check, but when you dive in, it actually shows some interesting differences. The first is that the main North American clade actually includes much more of Central America than the nuclear tree did. The second and potentially more interesting result is that the South America clade no longer includes one of the northern Peru samples. This Peru sample, being outside of the South American group, indicates that there might have been historical or current hybridization between these two species. Before I switch topics and dive into our work in Kansas, I want to summarize some of the takeaways from this project, looking at the entire range of the great horned owl. The first is that Bubo virginianus is not just Bubo virginianus. The genetic data confirm that Bubo magellanicus should be considered its own species, but that there's evidence of sharing historical genes or current hybridization between these two species. The second result is that there is very little genetic structure within the North American and Central American owls at this scale. Now I'm going to bring us a little bit closer to home and look at a contact zone between two populations in Kansas. The eastern Bubo virginianus and the western Bubo virginianus pallescens. What is cool about these birds is that they represent one of the darker and lighter subspecies within great horned owls. This means that we can not only study the genetics and plumage characteristics of the owls themselves, but they provide a unique background for studying other things, like the parasites of the owls. One of my specialties outside of birds is the parasitic lice that are found on bird feathers. Parasites, like birds or other animals, are often affected by their environment. In this case, their environment is the owls themselves. One cool fact about lice is that they often match the coloration of the birds they're found on, like the American robin in the lower right-hand corner. This is often due to the fact that birds rely on visually picking up lice off their feathers. So lice use camouflage to try to remain on the birds. This means that a bird that has very different plumage characteristics may be creating different populations of lice that are more adapted to one population of owls than another. On the other hand, louse populations may be more affected by the population structure of their hosts rather than the coloration. This contact zone of light to dark great horned owls in Kansas provides a perfect opportunity to test whether the genetics of their parasites are more affected by the ability to jump onto new hosts or the selective pressures of being removed by the owls they colonize. The image in the upper right-hand corner of this slide shows the great diversity of plumage characteristics that can be found in Kansas alone. This contact zone in Kansas is not new. The map here shows the historical range of the eastern and western populations characterized by Bob Dickerman. He used the plumage on museum specimens to identify eastern phenotypes shown by squares, western by circles, and mixed shown by stars. While I do not have the genetic data for either owls or lice to share today, I wanted to share with you some very new preliminary data based on the plumage of these owls. This is a screenshot of a program that converts photos of specimens to models of what an owl can see itself. It then takes those colors in the image and creates a graph of the colors here on the left. The darker the red in this graph, the more of that color is represented in the photo. The distance between one point and another on this graph indicates how different two colors are. The colors present on the owl are in the intersection of this graph, and the outline shows what is considered a just noticeable difference in color. Anywhere between the inside and the outside border, you would not be able to distinguish the difference in color if you were an owl. Here's an example of what colors the camera sees from a plumage patch in the middle of the owl's back. The two graphs on the right show the color of the extreme dark subspecies and the extreme light subspecies to provide perspective. The two graphs on the left show a compilation of the colors in western and eastern populations. The color of the eastern subspecies are much more concentrated and there is little spread. The western subspecies is much more variable in this color patch. Although I am just starting to get results back for the second project, I am excited about the possibilities of learning from this context zone. Right now, we know very little about the genetics of this context zone in either the birds or the lice. We are, however, beginning to analyze the color differences across this context zone. While I showed you some results based on color today, I might argue that coloration here is less important than the luminosity or patterns in barring. The western owls tend to be lighter with more fine barring than the eastern owls. This is something I will be looking into moving forward as well. I look forward to reading your comments and speaking with you about this exciting research. Thank you for listening.
Oh, wow.
Awesome. So very interesting stuff. And again, like I was seeing in the comments too, the information about the lice is very cool. And as Bram said, kind of scary.
Yeah.
So quick camouflage changes. And Emily is with us today answering questions. So if you guys have anything for her, she's on there answering stuff now. Really awesome stuff, but I guess we need to continue on.
I guess. I'm looking up these louse flies, though. They're very interesting.
Yeah. So, and it looks like we have Jeane Thompson next.
Yes.
And, all right. So Jeane Thompson is from Emporia State University, and she is doing a presentation called Do Behavioral Tendencies Present Reproductive Trade-offs in Dickcissels?
Hi, my name is Jeane Thompson. I am a graduate student at Emporia State University, where Dr. Jensen and I have been researching whether or not behavioral tendencies present reproductive trade-offs in female dickcissels. So we are looking at phenotypic variation in animal behavior. Most people are already familiar with behavior. It is an action or group of actions in response to some stimuli, and they are influenced by both genetic and environmental factors. Behavioral tendencies, which we are interested in, are the consistent individual differences in behavior. You might think of them as an individual's average level of behavior. Behavioral types, then, are a specific combination or suite of behavioral tendencies. So if we're talking about aggression, then things like biting, orienting towards a competitor, and chasing them away would fall under this umbrella type category. We in particular are interested in two behavioral types, boldness and activity. Boldness is defined as an individual's reaction to any risky situation such as predation, and it exists along a gradient called the shy-bold gradient, where you have individuals ranging in very risky behaviors and low risk behaviors. Activity, on the other hand, is an individual's basic level of activity, and it exists along its own gradient where you have more and less active also as its extremes. Dickcissels are a common grassland bird. They winter in Central and South America, then migrate up here to begin their breeding season in mid-May. They do like to nest in grass clumps where they lay 3 to 5 blue eggs. They are polygynous, so one male may have multiple females nesting within his territory, but once the mating is complete, parental care is primarily done by the female. Dickcissels are also one of many species which are parasitized or brood parasitized by the brown-headed cowbird. So when we're looking at these relationships, we're not just interested in boldness and activity, although that's what we're talking about today. We're also going to eventually look at how they relate to nest depredation, brood parasitism, and nestling condition, which are 3 components of reproductive success, and we can see how that all relates and affects their overall fitness. So I have just spent the first of 2 summers collecting data at the Tall Grass Prairie National Preserve. We started in mid-May with the arrival of the male dickcissels. We found a total of 82 nests spread throughout our 3 different sites that we set up within the preserve. We found the nests by tracking females via their behavior back to their nests, or occasionally we would randomly flush one as we were walking throughout the prairie. Once we found a nest, we would monitor it twice a week until it either fledged or failed. We observed their behavior and recorded the nest contents. Each monitoring session consisted of 3 main parts: the preliminary observation, which lasted 5 or 15 minutes, depending on whether or not the female was actively incubating. We measured chip rate, perch height, so whether she perched above, at, or below the grass canopy. Her mode of nest entry is either above or below the grass canopy. And the proportion of time she spent visible throughout the preliminary observation. These 4 measurements we considered measurements of boldness, but we also looked at rate of movement, interactions with other conspecifics or other dickcissels, and provisioning trips made to the nestling by the female. These ones we considered measurements of activity. We then approached the nest and flushed the female, which enabled us to obtain the flight initiation distance, FID, and that's how close the female was willing to let us get before fleeing the area, the distance that she flushed from the nest, and her post-flush behavior, or PFB, which we ranked from 1 being the least risky behavior and 5 being the most risky behavior, such as a distraction display. These, again, are also measures of boldness. Once we left the nest area, we started our secondary observation, where we recorded the same 4 measures of boldness, but we also added latency, which is the time it took to return for the female to return to the nest after being flushed. So our secondary observations ended as soon as the female returned to the nest, or we gave it a maximum of 25 minutes if she did not return. So our activities then, we looked at just rate of movement and conspecific interactions within the time that it took her to return to the nest. So if we're looking at the correlations now that we found between our secondary and preliminary observations, these are the measurements that 1 measurement was taken during the preliminary observation and 1 was taken during the secondary observation. So for instance, all of these are positive. So females who spent more time visible in the preliminary observation also on average spent more time visible in the secondary observation, and so on and so forth for each of these measurements. But we also, on the right here, we have the measurements that we took at the nest and were only measured once for each monitoring session. We found a couple of correlations with those as well. So for instance, females who tended to flush shorter distances after fleeing the nest had more risky post-flush behaviors, and shorter latencies. If we look just at the preliminary observation correlations, we see that they are, for this one, they are all positive correlations. And we see some interesting things. So females who were more visible in the preliminary observation also chipped more in the preliminary observation. They tended to perch higher, they moved more, and they interacted more. Females who chipped more during the preliminary observation also perched higher, had riskier post-flush behavior, and so on and so forth. In the secondary observation, we see not only a lot of the same correlations or similar correlations, really, but we see more correlations. And this is probably because a lot of these measures are measures of boldness, and in the secondary observation, this has taken place after we've approached the nest and looked in it, flushed her off, so we've become an active threat. And that might be why we are seeing more correlations in our secondary than our preliminary observation. So what we've done for all of these correlations, we performed the Kendall-Tau. So in blue, those were all our Tau correlation coefficients. Red were p-values. We did Kendall because our data was not normal and had ties, but we found three main patterns. The first of which is that females who were more bold in one context were always more bold in another context. So if they had a very short flight initiation distance, if they allowed you to get very close, they also had very risky post-flush behavior or something along those lines. It was never a bold behavior correlated with a shy behavior. The same goes for activity. The more active a female was in one context, the more active they were in the other context. And the most interesting was our third pattern that we found, where females who tended to be more bold in one context were also more active in another context. So this is hinting at what might be a possible behavioral syndrome, which is when two behavioral types correlate with one another, but we won't know more about that until we continue our data analysis. So our next step is to use multi-factor analysis to create composite scores for both boldness and activity. We will then compare those composite scores with our reproductive indices. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed doing it. I'd like to thank my committee members, Dr. Rebar and Dr. Amodar, as well as Dr. Martin, for helping me on this research, my research technician who worked very hard this summer, and of course, Emporia State University and Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve for giving me the means to do this research. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Awesome.
All right. So more fantastic research going on. So behavior is such an interesting thing to study.
An interesting thing to quantify too.
Yes, exactly. Pretty difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that Jeane is with us this afternoon, but again, you should have a way to contact her through email or through the comments if you have questions about the research that she's doing. So thanks, Jeane, for submitting. And then we will move on to our next presenter, which is Lucas DeCicco. And he's with the University of Kansas and working on the breeding providence of non-Harlani dark morph red-tailed hawks wintering in Kansas.
Jeane is here.
Oh, great. Yay.
So there you go. Ask Jeane all your questions.
Yes.
And she's right here to answer them.
Good deal. All right. So chat with her and we'll start our next.
All right, thank you all for tuning in. My name is Lucas DeCicco. I'm a PhD student at the University of Kansas under the advisement of Rob Moyle. Today I'm going to be talking about a new project that we've got going on red-tailed hawks, and I'm very excited to share some information with you. I'm going to break this talk up into broadly two sections. The first section will be more of a broad description of this project, and the second section will focus on our pilot season that we did last year. And that pilot season work was partially supported by KOS and their Student Research Fund Award, which we're very thankful for. All right, a bit of background on the project. This is a very collaborative project. It's just getting going, but we're excited about it starting to build some steam. Our author line describes that collaboration well. The main collaborators are me, Mark Robbins at University of Kansas, Bryce Robinson, who's now at Cornell University, and Brian Sullivan, who's at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And broadly, the purpose of this project is to understand the plumage variation, geographic bounds to subspecies, and kind of distribution of certain red-tailed hawk subspecies or plumage types in areas that we really have a poor understanding of those matters. These areas are primarily more remote locations, northern Canada, western Canada, and Alaska, areas where red-tailed hawks breed in really low densities, and coverage is pretty sparse. And we're taking a new approach to this, well, a different approach, where we're deploying transmitters on certain birds on the wintering grounds and seeing where they end up to nest in the summer. And that strategy, we can target certain phenotypes or plumage birds that we're really interested in seeing where they're breeding. The overall goal of all this work is to begin to provide a baseline, increase our understanding of the system overall by providing a baseline of known breeding locations linked with high-quality photos of these birds' plumage and genetic samples. This database per se is feeding directly into Bryce Robinson's PhD research. He'll be using these data immediately, and we will make all these samples available to researchers, throughout the world who are interested in this system. A bit of background on the system. Red-tailed hawks are a common North American species, and they're highly polytypic, which means there's many described geographic forms or subspecies. Here, this map depicts estimates of breeding distributions. Here in Kansas, we have the eastern borealis subspecies. Just north of us, in the northern Great Plains, is a pale critter called criders, or subspecies crideri. North of that, across the central and eastern Canadian boreal forest, is a northern subspecies named Abieticola. That's basically a more well-marked version of borealis. In the west, there's broadly Harlani in Alaska and western Canada, a coastal Alicensis subspecies, and then this western Coloration subspecies. Now there are two kind of characteristics of this system that complicate this matter even more. The eastern birds are broadly monomorphic, so they only have a light morph that we know of, and the western birds, Harlani and Coloration particularly, are polymorphic, which means they have both a dark and a light morph, and even intermediate morphs. Even more complicating the system even more is the fact that it's a continental system, meaning that wherever these described subspecies come in contact, they typically form broad zones of intergradation and intermediate phenotypes. So you can see that area in northeastern British Columbia, that's a highly complex area with influence from many different subspecies and probably a whole mix of different looking phenotypes occurring there. And these are the areas that we understand most poorly because they breed in low densities there, difficult to access. So that's kind of the target of this research broadly, is to understand these more complicated remote regions. Turns out Kansas is a wonderful place to study red-tailed hawks. Here in Kansas in the winter, we have probably the most diverse, as far as geographic variation and phenotypic plumage diversity is concerned, the most diverse wintering populations of red-tailed hawks in the continent. And this is really what spurred on this research. We see all this phenomenal diversity in plumage and plumage aspect and, dark and light morphs. We can make a guess, and it's an educated guess, to where these birds are breeding and to what subspecies they should be ascribed. But really, to really start nailing this down and working forward and understanding these systems better, tracking these birds to where they're nesting is needed. So what we did last winter, this happened in our pilot season, was in March last year after we got all of our permits squared away. Our target question last year was to basically determine what these dark plumage birds pictured here, this is Bryce holding one of these birds in question, what they might be. So in Kansas in the winter we have kind of two different phenotypes of dark birds, the Harlans, which breed in Alaska and Western Canada, and then this bird in question. And this is a relatively common phenotype here in eastern Kansas. There are two competing hypotheses to what it is. They're either dark colurus, that western breeding subspecies that are wintering a little bit farther east than you'd expect, or they are a dark version or a dark morph, previously undescribed dark morph of Abieticola, which is that northern Canadian boreal forest breeding subspecies. So our goal was to trap two of these birds, deploy transmitters on them, and see where they nested. We spent 10 days trapping birds in Kansas last March. Bryce came down and we did a lot of driving on dirt roads. We ended up capturing two of these dark phenotype birds in question and deployed two GPS GSM transmitters. These transmitters obtain very high quality location data via GPS and then transmit them over cell phone towers and networks. So they're really great transmitters for this question, with the one issue is that they go out of touch when they're out of cell phone service. So this is what we found. The two birds pictured on the right are the two birds that we deployed transmitters on, and these lines are their annual cycle. So both transmitters went on in Lawrence, close to Lawrence. We're really happy with the results. Both birds appeared to be healthy and they migrated great. Both transmitters worked exactly as predicted, and we're super happy with the data. We've got multiple points per day throughout the year, or throughout this annual cycle. They went out of touch, out of cell phone service in Alberta, and then went and bred at those locations, and then uploaded all their data in September when they came back. As we speak, one of the birds is actually in North Dakota now, and it very well could be back down in Lawrence by the time this talk goes up. So let's talk about the breeding locations. These points represent where the birds bred. Putting that into context with that distribution map that I showed earlier, turns out that they went to basically the most complicated and quite poorly understood region of North America as far as red-tailed hawk distribution and subspecies are concerned. This does not give us any clear answers, but it raises many more questions than answers, and it's very cool that these birds went to this super complicated area, because now we have genetic samples from both of these birds. We have really good photographs of all their plumage aspects, and we know how they migrated. So we're starting to unravel, piece by piece, some of the complexities of this system. However, there's lots to do, and we're excited about it. We've got ambitious plans for this coming year. We'd like to deploy more transmitters on different phenotype birds to basically test if some of our assumptions are correct or not. We'd like to deploy transmitters on light Abieticola, or that northern breeding subspecies, to see if they also go to Western Canada or if they go straight north to breed. We'd like to track a more typical looking light Coloris to see if they also go to the same area or a different area. And we're going to start supplementing this tracking information with deploying a whole lot of color bands, which will be readable in the field. So keep an eye out for those in Kansas. Farther in the future, as we develop this genetic database, we plan on doing some more population level structuring analyses, genomic work that will give us an idea of the evolutionary history and population structure in this species, and include additional tracking locations, deploy transmitters on the East Coast, etc. If you're interested in this work, check out our website. We've got a blog on here where we'll post updates on where our birds are, what we've done that season, when we're deploying color bands, photos of the birds that we're deploying transmitters on. And since transmitters are expensive and we want more of them, we've started a crowdfunding page. So if you're interested in this work and have the resources to contribute and the interest to contribute any money towards this, it would be greatly appreciated. We're accessing funding from multiple sources. But yeah, if you're interested in supporting this, it would be very appreciated. With that, I'd like to thank our collaborators. It's a really great group of people to work with. Exciting project to see really start going. I'd like to thank John Bolin and Dave Rintoul, who helped us in the field last year. And funding for this pilot season was provided by KOS, Burroughs Audubon Society, and the Hawk Migration Association of North America. With that, I thank you for your time, and I will do my best to answer any questions you guys can post to the YouTube link. Thank you.
Great. Here, I'm going to stop sharing this.
All right. So, and I do know that Lucas is not with us today. He is actually getting ready to go out on some field work, so he can't join us now, but he would be more than happy to answer questions via his YouTube video comments or his email address.
I'm putting a link in the comments to his video so that, you know, if you want to go make sure he sees that, you might go send him some comments out there. Cool. Yeah.
All right. Okay, and I think we have about four videos left. So last but not least, next up is Dr. Alixandra Godar from Kansas State University, and also she's with the Kansas Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. And her presentation is on supporting grassland birds using spring cover crops.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity for me to talk about my research that I've done in Kansas, working with spring cover crops and grassland birds. So as you're probably aware, grassland birds are declining around the world. And a lot of these declines are attributed to agricultural intensification and the resulting pesticide use, habitat loss, and habitat fragmentation. So people are searching for ways to decrease the impact of agriculture on birds and other wildlife. And one of the more recent suggestions is by planting cover crops. So for Kansas, this refers primarily to spring cover crops in western Kansas because it works really well with the current crop rotation of grain, sorghum, or corn over to winter wheat. And so the current typical practice is chemical fallow. And so it's when you leave the field empty, using herbicide as necessary to prevent unwanted growth until they're ready to plant their next cash crop. Now, instead of that, cover crops have the landowner planting whatever mix they want. There's a huge variety out there, and they don't harvest it for profit, but they let it grow and then they terminate it and reap a lot of soil benefits. For example, you can plant nitrogen fixing plants to increase the nitrogen content of the field. And this works really well with a lot of systems because there's a huge variety and that vary in timing, and you get a healthier field, and a lot of people see increased crop yields as well. And so the landowner has a lot of potential benefit from this, but we think it's really beneficial for wildlife as well, though very little work has been done to look at cover crops from a wildlife perspective. And so I wanted to look at wildlife with some typical wildlife measurements that we take. So first, I wanted to look at vegetation and invertebrate diversity among different cover type patches that we find in Kansas. So this includes wheat fields, the cover crop mixes, conservation reserve program land, and vegetation. We're looking at things like percent composition, visual obstruction, so how thick is the vegetation? Does it provide a lot of cover or not very much? And then invertebrate diversity. Invertebrates include all of the insects and then also spiders and ticks, which tend to hang out with the insects. So we wanted to keep those in there too. And so I wanted to compare those among all of the cover type patches. And then I did want to look at some specific different cover crop mixes, since there is a huge variety of mixes out there. And I wanted to focus on comparing those mixes to each other, and I wanted to compare them to the typical practice, which is that chemical fallow I talked about earlier, and something that is actually known to be good bird habitat, which we chose conservation reserve program land. So I worked in Western Kansas for 3 years. We were based out of Hill City, Kansas in Graham County, though we worked in a total of 4 counties over the duration of my project. And this is just an example cover type map of one of our study areas. The orange is crop fields, either active or inactive, and the teal color is grasslands, which tended to be cattle pastures. And so you can see it really is an agriculturally dominated landscape. And it seemed like a really good place to look at how spring cover crops influence wildlife in an agriculturally dominated landscape. So we were wanting about 40-acre treatment fields for our cover crop fields. We did have 4 treatments, so we looked for about quarter section areas that we could divide equally into 4 parts. And we had 3 different seed mixes we wanted to look at, and then we also wanted to include a chemical fallow plot as a negative control. So we looked at chemical fallow for one of our treatments, and then we had Chick Magnet was one of the other treatments we selected. It's a seed mix designed by Star Seed Company. It consists of broadleaf worm season forbs, and it was actually designed for precocial chicks by the seed company, so the chicks will leave the nest right after hatch. We also included one of their more traditional agricultural mixes called Green Spring, which consists of oats and cool season peas, and it can actually be hayed and fed to cattle as a termination method. And we also included a custom mix that was developed with a Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism biologist and Star Seed Company to provide a wide variety of benefits for both the landowner and for local wildlife. And every week we went out there and we conducted 5 vegetation surveys where we looked at things like percent composition. So you can see that PVC pipe frame that's on the ground. We would put that on the ground in 5 different places at the point and 4 meters in every cardinal direction. And we'd look at how much of the frame was grass, how much was bare ground, things like that. And then we would average among the frames. And we also did visual obstruction, which is that pole sticking out of the ground. So each section is a decimeter. And then we would stand 4 meters away in the cardinal directions and look at it and figure out which decimeter was 100% blocked, which one was 75% blocked, and so on. And then average among the cardinal directions again. We did this for our cover crop fields, the chemical fallow treatment, conservation reserve program land, which we assume is good grassland bird habitat, and then also wheat fields, which is the dominant cover type. And we also did 2 invertebrate surveys for each patch. So you can see kind of the zigzag pattern. Each line is 100 meters long, and we would walk the 100 meters, sweeping each pace, and then put the insects in a bag at the end so we could take them and count them and weigh them when we got them. So we wanted to see if there was any difference among the different patches out there. And so in order to do that, we had a couple different steps we had to go through. So first, we used a MLWA to basically look at all of the different measurements and say, if you're looking at all of these, is there some difference somewhere in all of these measurements we're telling you between the different patches? Which we got a yes. So then we went on to the next step, and so then we pulled out all of the different measurements we took individually, and we went, okay, is there a difference in this measurement? And then for all of the ones that we had yes, which was actually everything we looked at, we ran another test and we said, okay, so of these patches that we're looking at, which ones are different from each other? And that was the LSD test. So we did this for our vegetation surveys, which were from May through August for 2017 and 2018, and our invertebrate surveys from June 2017. We had to stop sorting prematurely due to COVID-19. So moving on to the data, so each column is a different patch type, and the letters, if they have the same letter, it means they're not statistically different from each other, but if they have different letters, it means the test found them to be different from each other. So if you look at the far left, that's chemical fallow, so our negative control, and then the far right is actually just common cover type of wheat, but second to the right is Conservation Reserve Program land, which is our positive control, and then all of our cover crop mixes are in the middle, so you can compare them as you go. And you'll see in chemical fallow on the far left there had very few number of insects compared to everybody else, with some shuffling among the different cover types, but we also looked at insect mass, and you can see again chemical fallow came in really low, but there is some jumping around with everybody else. And from a vegetation perspective, everybody was different from everybody else when you're looking at 75% visual obstruction, which was that pole. So basically if you're looking sideways through the vegetation, is providing a lot of cover. And all of the cover crop mixes did better than chemical fallow, but not as good as Conservation Reserve Program land. And then we see a similar pattern when we're looking at overhead cover. So when we're looking down on the vegetation, how much cover is it providing? So all chemical fallow provided fewer invertebrate and vegetation resources for local wildlife for pretty much everything we looked at. We did find Green Spring, which is an agricultural mix, and the custom mix we designed more closely resemble Conservation Reserve Program land, so our habitat metric, than Chick Magnet, which was the forb-only mix. Which, there's a few things that this is really good. So if you remember when I was talking about some of the issues with agricultural intensification, I said increased pesticide use is bad, kills a lot of insects that birds like to eat. So the higher invertebrate numbers and biomass that we saw in cover crop compared to chemical fallow was really good. And then we saw increased cover from both sideways and overhead, which has the potential to help mitigate some of that habitat loss and habitat fragment issues by potentially connecting existing habitat patches and providing temporary habitat when it's out there. So it looks like planting cover crops has a lot of potential to benefit grassland birds. We're not sure how wide their distance of influence is. All of our fields we looked at were right next to Conservation Reserve Program land, so we do want to look at that a little bit more closely. But it does look like any mix was better than chemical fallow, so landowners really have a wide variety of options so that they can plant whatever they want to get the benefits they want for their field and still provide some benefits for wildlife. But if you're going at it from a wildlife perspective, the mixes that did contain a grass and forb component more closely resembled what we know to be existing bird habitat. So that might play some influence in what landowners choose to do in the future. A ton of people put a ton of effort into this project. I sadly don't have time to name them all, but local biologists, landowners who were willing to plant our mixes, technicians who helped collect data. I was out of Kansas State University in the Kansas Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit for my PhD, and everybody was great, and this project wouldn't have been possible without them. I did put my email up there in case people want to email me with further questions, and I hope you all enjoyed my talk. Thanks for listening.
Great. Gotta love practical, helpful research like that.
Yeah.
I'm not able to really see her email because my webcam is directly in the way, but I will try to get her email.
I was having the same trouble, but we will make sure and get her her information so that anybody can contact her. And then our next talk, let me make sure I've got this right. Okay, next up is Bram Verheijen also with the Kansas Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit in Kansas State University. And he's asking, is grassland always grassland? So this is about the spatial variation in the selection of grassland patches by lesser prairie chickens during the breeding season.
I love it. Here we go.
All right, welcome to my presentation about resource selection of lesser prairie chickens during the breeding season. As you all know, grassland ecosystems have seen some large-scale declines in the US since European settlements. Land use change and agricultural intensification have led to habitat loss and fragmentation for many wildlife species. And only last year, Rosenberg et al. Showed again that grassland birds have seen some of the largest declines of any avian gill within the US and Canada. One of these species, the lesser prairie chicken, grassland obligate prairie grouse, have been especially affected by habitat loss and fragmentation. The range of population numbers have declined by about 90%. In recent years, they've been listed or delisted, but are still of conservation concern. Unfortunately, the management of lesser prairie chickens is very complex, especially since resource needs vary greatly throughout the breeding season, with lekking, nesting, and brooding. However, knowing about resource selection of this species could really help figuring out how to manage largely privately owned landscapes that they occur on. Today, I will show some preliminary analysis looking at the resource selection of lesser prairie chickens during the breeding season. We already know a lot about resource selection of lesser prairie chickens at broad scales. We know that they don't like trees. We do know that they don't like anthropogenic structures like oil wells, power lines, and roads. We do know that they like grass. At least they need a lot of grass on the landscape to even occur, at least 60% in a 5-kilometer buffer, and thrive on like higher values, like 70 or 80% grassland. However, this raises some questions like, what kind of grass? Any grass, and does it matter what kind of grass? Not all grasslands are the same, of course. What's truly available for selection depends on many factors, such as whether a grassland is burned and the fire frequency occurs on, whether a pasture is grazed or not, and the grazing regime takes place, patchwork grazing, season-long stocking, rotational grazing, etc. And the presence or absence or abundance of specific key species like sand sagebrush that is very influential within the lesser prairie chicken range. Moreover, resource selection of lesser prairie chickens might also vary spatially. They occur in 4 distinct ecoregions: the mixed grass prairie in Kansas and the Oklahoma, Texas panhandle, in sand sagebrush prairie in eastern Colorado and western Kansas, the shortgrass prairie in CRP mosaic in northwestern Kansas, and sand shinnery oak prairie in New Mexico and Texas. And the vegetation communities in all these ecoregions are very distinct. So therefore, which grassland patches are truly available and which ones are selected will therefore likely vary throughout the prairie chicken range as well. This brings me to my research questions. So for this project, we established grassland patches instead of just grassland, yes or no, based on grazing, burning, dominant vegetation type, and the presence of sand sagebrush. And this is at 4 sites during 2013 to 2018. And we answered the following questions. Do lesser prairie chickens select for or against certain grassland patch types? And does selection of grassland patch types differ among sites or not? To answer these questions, we trapped lesser prairie chickens at 4 sites in Colorado, Northwest, and our sites Clark and Red Hills in the mixed grass prairie. And together, 4 sites in Kansas, Colorado represent 3 of the 4 occupied ecoregions. And we pulled the 2 subsites in Colorado for sample sizes to form 1 site. And our 4 sites follow an east to west precipitation gradient with consequences for the vegetation that occurs in these landscapes, with less rain resulting in lower vegetation. At those sites, we trapped lesser prairie chickens using walk-in traps and drop nets. And then we put VHF or GPS satellite transmitters on them so we could follow them around on the landscape and know what they actually use. Then we measured vegetation at used and available locations and compared those. For used locations, we had about 4,000 points. We took 2 per week per bird per site during the spring and the summer, random locations. And available locations, we did a little bit more. We had about 12,000 points. We first determined the study area as a minimum convex polygon around all GPS locations at a certain site. Then we established grassland patches based on range of management and apparent differences in vegetation due to maybe underlying variation in soil, elevation, or other factors. Then in all those patches, we took 1 to 30 locations per patch per site during the spring and summer to measure vegetation as well. At all those used and available locations, we measured grass cover, forb cover, shrub cover, bare ground, and litter cover with a Dommeyer frame, and we also took maximum vegetation height in 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100% visual obstruction readings with the use of a rolled alcohol, as you can see on the right. Took these measurements in all 4 cardinal directions at 4 meter distance of the point and at the center of the point as well, and then averaged those values. Then categorized each of the sampled patches according to a set of rules to come up with the patch type. First, whether a patch was grazed or not, then whether a patch was burnt or not that particular year, whether sand sagebrush was present during any year based on separate transect surveys, and then vegetation cover type based on dominant cover type, whether it's like grass-dominated, forb-dominated, grass-forb mixture, or whether it had shrubs in it and at least 10% of them. We then measured the area of each patch type to determine their relative availability, and finally, we assigned all the used points to grassland patch type based on their location. And this is what we found. First of all, some key differences among patch types. First of all, CRP fields were never burned or grazed, and they often had tall vegetation, and especially in the western sites, taller vegetation than we found in pastures. When we compared grazed and ungrazed pastures, which is an anomaly in Colorado, we saw that less grass cover and more shrub cover in the ungrazed pastures. Burned versus unburned pastures, we only had those in the Red Hills, and we saw less grass and litter cover, but more background and lower structure in burnt pastures, which makes sense. We also looked at the cover classes, and because we used our own cutoff rules, they matched those. And finally, sand sagebrush, whether it was present or not, we didn't find any differences between those patch types in other vegetation characteristics. So any selection based on that would have to do with the sand sagebrush itself. All right, so I'll go from west to east to show the patterns of selection. We'll start with Colorado. The next couple of slides, I'll show similar slides to this one. So that you can see here on top, we first have the percent available on the landscape. And you can see in Colorado that it mostly consisted out of grassy CRP fields, grassy grazed pastures, and grassy ungrazed pastures. So that's what's available. And then I'll use selection ratios to show the actual selection. Selection ratios are percent used locations divided by the percentage of available area. So if they would be the same, no selection, it would be 1, but you can imagine a selection ratio of 2. It would be twice as many locations in that particular patch type related to how much it is available on the landscape. This is what we found. In Colorado, lesser prairie chickens select for CRP fields, and very strongly so. If you zoom in a little bit more, you can see that they also select against grazed pastures, with some of these categories not even having a single used location in them, although they make up almost 15% of the landscape. When we move on to the northwest, we see that this mostly existed out of grassy CRP fields and grassy pastures. Not a lot of other things going on here. And what I actually select is select for sand sagebrush and shrubby areas instead on the right. Although shrubs are not even that available on the landscape in large amounts. In Clark, we see that the landscape consists out of a mix of forby, grassy, and shrubby pastures, mostly grassy pastures. When we look at selection patterns, we see that lesser prairie chickens on this side select pastures with mostly forbs. When we go to the Red Hills, we see that the Red Hills consist out of mostly grassy pastures, unburned pastures, but there's also some burned grassy pastures and some pastures with grass and forb mixture in them. And here as well, just like the Clark side, we see that lesser prairie chickens select for pastures with forbs. Very strong selection on the right, on the left here. And if you zoom in a little bit more, we see that also grass forb mixtures are selected for, and they mostly select against all grass types, and just grassy pastures without forbs or shrubs in them. So the sun is all up. There are a lot of graphs, and luckily you can pause it. On the west here in Colorado, we could see that lesser prairie-chicken selected for CRP fields, and it might be because of structure. It's a western side, low vegetation, except for in the CRP fields. In the northwest, they selected for pastures with shrubs or a scent sagebrush. Again, in a relatively arid environment, this could provide some structure on the landscape for chickens to use during the breeding season as cover or other ways. However, we see a different pattern in the Clark and the Red Hills on the right bottom here, where in both sites they selected for pastures with forbs. So maybe structure is not as limited in those sites, and forbs are much more important potentially as a food source. So conclusions, we've seen that overall lesser prairie chickens seem to select taller grasses or pastures with at least 10% shrubs or scent sagebrush in the western sites where the precipitation is limited. So overall, resource selection shows considerable variation among sites, even within the same ecoregion. And although that's cool from an ecological perspective, the lack of fixed selection patterns might be very frustrating from a management perspective, since they seem to be doing something different everywhere you go. Of course, there's a bunch of questions that remain. We see different selection patterns in different sites in years, although I didn't show that. But is the end product always the same if available? Is a patch type approach an improvement of our broad category grassland, or a fine scale vegetation measurements only approach? How do other landscape factors interact with patch type selection? Anthropogenic structures, presence of nearby trees, grassland availability at the larger scale. And finally, how does patch selection during the breeding season depend on breeding stage when birds are on the nest or with chicks? And with that, I acknowledge all these people, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, this is my email address. Thank you.
I'll take this down, and there we go. I'm like just digesting.
Yeah.
The information.
Excellent question. So, and Bram is available on our chat, I believe, still to answer questions. And we have two videos left. So we'll go ahead and press on with those.
Okay.
The next one is by Curtis Wolf with the Kansas Wetlands Education Center and Fort Hays State University. And his talk is regarding window bird strikes at a nature center, an unfortunate and ironic case study.
Hello, my name is Curtis Wolf, Director at the Kansas Wetlands Education Center at Cheyenne Bottoms in Barton County, and I kill birds. All kidding aside, it pains me to say this, as I work in one of the most diverse bird hotspots in the state, and it is a bit depressing or painful for me to give this program today, as the results that I'm going to be talking about literally go against everything we preach at the Education Center. Today I'm going to talk about a 10-year monitoring effort that we've done at the Wetlands Center regarding window bird strikes. However, I will also talk about hopefully some plans that we have in place to bring light to this problem and hopefully improve our bird killing record in the near future. Now it's been realized for quite a long time that birds will and do run into windows. Bird window collisions have been identified as a major human-induced threat to birds, and estimates of 100 million to 1 billion bird mortalities per year in the United States have been linked to window collisions, which place it second only behind feral cats as a human-influenced cause of bird mortality. About half of all window collisions result in the death of the bird. However, we often do not know what the extent of the injuries are and the actual long-term fate of some collisions. Obviously, the bane of windows is the fact that they create a solid yet transparent barrier, or they reflect outdoor images that can't be deciphered as a mere reflection by flying birds. The Kansas Wetlands Education Center opened in April of 2009, and we really do some incredible things to promote wildlife and birds, environmental education, and interpreting Cheyenne Bottoms. However, the architecture of the KWEC building is not as bird-friendly as we would like it to be. While the back of the building is very conducive to visitors being able to look out over the expansive mitigation marsh to the south and the east, the more than 80 large windows around the building proved to be more than just hard to keep clean. They also present a pretty severe hazard to our feathered friends. Now, these walls of glass are all too common in modern architecture, and unfortunately there are many examples of buildings just like ours that are posing a similar effect on many species of birds. Now, shortly after the center opened in 2009, we noticed several bird window collisions. We decided it was worth turning into a monitoring project and started recording all collisions that we observed, whether they resulted in a death or not. For each collision, we recorded the date of the collision, the species, window location, and whether or not it resulted in a fatality. From 2010 to 2019, we recorded 142 total window strikes, with just more than half of those being observed as fatal. Now, our records were quite circumstantial and not a systematic survey where we would regularly search the grass surrounding the building for carcasses, so it is likely that we were missing a number of collisions. However, this fatality rate that we observed of 52% fell pretty close to the generally reported figure in other studies that about half of all window strikes are fatal. Unfortunately, we have developed a pretty lengthy species richness in the 142 total window strikes that we've observed. 27 species in all have been recorded in collisions at KWEC, and 20 of those species, 20 of those species had at least one fatality, shown by the bolded species names on this table. Barn swallows had our most total strikes, followed by American tree sparrows, red-winged blackbirds, dark-eyed juncos, and American goldfinches. Interestingly, the bird groups that we recorded with the highest strike incidences, swallows, blackbirds, and sparrows, are all listed as below average vulnerability to collision mortality in comparison to other bird groups by a study that Loss et al. Did in 2015. This graph just shows the same information as the previous table in a graphical form. However, I'd like to point out that while barn swallows have had the most total strikes, most of their strikes have not been fatal, as they have only the third most fatalities listed. You also can see in the line graph on this graph that while some of the species have had collisions most years, no species that we've recorded has collisions recorded every year in the 10-year study. Now, this figure shows the strikes and fatalities that we recorded per year at KWEC, with the highest number of strikes and fatalities being in 2011. Now, fatalities were not significantly different over these 10 years, but in general, the trend line for collisions has decreased since 2010. And I'll also point out that during the drought years of 2012 and 2013, we did see lower fatalities, which corresponded to an overall lower bird abundance that we observed in the area during those years. Throughout the year, we tend to see the most collisions happen in the months of December, January, and February, with another small increase in June and August. In terms of seasons, this corresponds to most collisions seemingly occurring with winter and summer resident birds, as opposed to seeing a lot of migrants impacting our windows during the spring and fall. With the incredible migration that we see through Cheyenne Bottoms, I guess the fact that we are not seeing many spring and fall migrant species showing up on our collision list, maybe that could be seen as a fortunate silver lining in our data. When we started recording collisions, we thought it would be interesting to record where on the building the collisions were happening, so that we went about by numbering the sections of windows across the back of the center and recorded which window section the collisions occurred in. We hoped that if only one or a couple window areas were causing the majority of the collisions, we could target those areas to help remedy our problem in the simplest way possible. However, we have found that all window sections have produced collisions and fatalities, and the fatality numbers were not significantly different among the different window sections. From the graph, you may notice that windows 7, 8, and 9 have the highest incidences of collisions, which can probably be attributed to these windows' proximity to our front desk, where there's typically always a staff person seated. Consequently, it's much more likely that the collisions are going to be observed at these 3 windows, whereas at other locations around the building, we're more reliant on finding the bird's carcass to identify a strike. This may suggest that we are missing a lot of non-fatal collisions in other parts of the building. So in conclusion, KWEC has observed 142 total bird window collisions in a 10-year period, with a fatality percentage of just over half, which corresponds with documented fatality rates of bird window collisions that have been reported elsewhere. Abundant bird species, especially summer and winter resident species, appear to be more prone to window strikes at KWEC. Fortunately, bird strikes at KWEC have shown a slight decline over the 10-year study period, and unfortunately, no single window location at KWEC seems to be having higher window strike incidences than other windows. Now, this is an issue that we really do need to continue to monitor at KWEC, and if nothing else, presenting this data at this meeting has rejuvenated me to look into a more permanent solution to help out the problem at KWEC. As most of you know, numerous solutions are out there for how to combat window bird collisions. However, I haven't really found a particular solution that is perfect. Finding a solution that is 1, effective at reducing the collisions, 2, cost effective, 3, maintenance effective, and 4, not terribly intrusive, and finally 5, that's just logical, is easier said than done. I do encourage you to visit the American Bird Conservancy's website that they have on preventing bird window collisions, which provides some excellent resources on the subject. Now, we have seriously looked into several of these solutions that are listed on that website and others. Now, I'm not a real big fan of netting due to the intrusiveness of this look, as well as the maintenance and longevity problems that netting would present due to winds in this area. So we haven't actually gone with netting. Window decals seem pretty effective, but being able to clean the windows around them and then placing enough decals on the windows to be effective seem to be pretty ineffective and inefficient. A window film called Solix with printed lines has been proven quite effective in tests and has shown some promise with our application. It seems less intrusive than many of the other solutions. However, I received a price quote from one glass company to install this particular film on 53 of the windows on the back of KWEC. That quote was in 2017. And the estimated bill came to $30,000 to put that film on. And the other problem is the lifespan of that film, they documented as only being about 10 years before it would have to be replaced. I was recently informed about a device called a Copian bird saver that people can make just using paracord. Now, this solution seems pretty simple and cost effective, and I think it possibly has there's a possibility for using this at the center. Overall, I think that we have an opportunity to turn a very negative situation at KWEC into a great educational opportunity. You know, maybe our solution is that we have a test of a combination of different solutions, and by using our baseline collision data that we've taken so far in these first 10 years, we can effectively monitor and then rank the effectiveness of several different bird window collision solutions. I look forward to looking into those and in the near future, hopefully presenting some of those findings to this group soon. I would like to thank the KWEC staff for helping track these window strikes over these last 10 years. I also would like to thank Lauren Jarbo and Kirsten Granstrom Arndt, both Fort Hays graduate students in biological sciences and KWEC graduate students, for their help in analyzing the data and helping put together this presentation. So please let me know if you have any questions or comments by posting in the comments section of this program. and I thank you for your time.
Well, thanks, Curtis.
Yes, thank you, Curtis. This is something that I, in particular, have dealt with at my nature center as well. Of course, we don't have near as many windows as what they have at KWAC. So I was able to use some kaleidoscope tape, and that virtually cut down, I think, from 12 bird strikes to 0 the next year.
Wow.
So there are some sources out there that really do work. So excellent information. And like he said, check out the ABC's information on how to prevent those. All right, so last talk of the day, last but not least, and this is from Dr. A. Townsend Peterson with the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute. And he is presenting on the closing a major biogeographic barrier, the Great Plains of North America.
Hello, everybody. My name is Townsend Peterson. I am a professor at the University of Kansas in the Division of Ornithology of the Biodiversity Institute. And I'll be presenting to you work today that's co-authored by myself and Fernando Machado Stredo, who is a doctoral student, doctoral candidate, also in the Biodiversity Institute of the University of Kansas. So this work is about the Great Plains as a major biogeographic barrier in North America. And most of you will be familiar with the general distribution of major biomes across North America, and this orange swath that goes north-south, basically from Mexico to Canada, is the Great Plains, and it's been perceived as a broad, unforested region. You can see it here in this map from NASA of forest cover, and you can see, well, here at the University of Kansas, we're kind of at the western edge of the eastern forests. And just across the Great Plains, you'd get to the Rocky Mountains, and you'd be at the eastern edge of the western forests. And so this has been perceived as a major biogeographic barrier, at least for forest inhabiting organisms, one of the major biological features of North America. So what I've done in this work, again in collaboration with Fernando, is to pick out 16 bird species that are forest associated, mostly forest restricted, in eastern North American forests, and that they be species that not have populations just on the other side, just west of the Great Plains. So you all can sort through this image and pick out all sorts of familiar faces. Now, the other thing that we've done is to take the breeding bird survey routes in this region, and we're really focusing on Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. But what we're going to do is take the breeding bird survey routes, and you're going to see this diagram several times. The size of the symbol indicates the age. And so these small symbols mean old, very newly established routes, and these large symbols mean older routes going back to the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so the sort of thing that we're analyzing is something like this, where you can see old records of pileated woodpeckers in eastern Oklahoma and up here in northeastern Texas. But notice that these records on the northern and western rim of the distribution of the species are all new, which is to say small circles indicating presences. And in many cases, it's a new presence on an old route. So the X's indicate absence, the circles indicate presence. And what you can see is that pileated woodpeckers have expanded their distributions up into eastern Kansas rather dramatically. And for this species, we've shown it also as a set of polygons going from black with the oldest routes going up to red in the newest routes. And you can see that range expansion basically in the last 2 decades. Here's Louisiana water thrush. And again, what we see is kind of new detections along the periphery of the range of the species. And one more example, red-shouldered hawk, where we see a pretty broad invasion across central and even into central western Oklahoma and central Texas. So I'm not going to go through all 16 in the interest of time, but what I'd like you to see now is a bit of an analysis of general patterns looking across all 16 of these species. And so what we've done is to assemble 6 independent variables. One is the decade. A second is the minimum temperature for that, averaged over years, but across that decade. The annual precipitation averaged over years for that decade. Forest cover in the middle of that decade. Effort, which is the number of BBS routes that were run in that decade, and the latitudinal bands. And this is a set of 2-degree latitudinal bands that go across the whole region. As a dependent variable, we use simply the aerial coverage of an alpha hull around the known range of the species in that decade. So essentially a hull that kind of snugs onto the points and more or less delimits the ends of the range. And what we've done is a series of general linear models. For the moment, we've left out interactions amongst variables, and we've done these models for each species separately. And I just want you to see some general patterns, but first let's look at the drivers. Here's a map of mean annual temperature change between the 1960s and present. And what you can see is it's basically all warming, but it's warming more in some places and less in other places. Another major driver is that of afforestation. Here are just 2 images. Almena in Norton County, an image from the early 1900s, and you can see quite restricted forest just around the village, and now very broad along the roadway and much farther out from the river course. Here's the Harding Presidential Memorial in Reno County. Notice no trees on the horizon, and then last month, trees quite abundant along the horizon. And I've taken dozens, actually more than 100 photographs of this sort, and I can tell you that this afforestation is an extremely common phenomenon across Kansas. So going back to our models, here are those independent variables, essentially the drivers: decade, latitudinal band, minimum temperature, precipitation, effort, which is to say number of BBS routes, and forest cover. And here are our 16 species. And what I want you to see is that there's quite a bit of mixed effects. So for example, latitudinal bands, we see a positive effect of essentially expansion in the north for the 2 goat suckers, for Chuck-will's widow and whippoorwill, but negative effects for others. For 2 variables, we see a fairly dominant directional effect. For effort, we see most of the species responding positively to more sampling effort. That makes all the sense in the world. And for most of the species, we also see a positive aerial effect relating to decade. And so that is this expansion process. Now what we need to sort through is what are the effects of these other drivers like climate change, temperature and precipitation, and landscape change in the form of afforestation. So this is very clearly work in progress, but I just wanted to share this work with you, and I'd be very interested in hearing feedback and hearing insights that you may have, given that this is a group that has quite a bit of experience across the state. So in summary, I think there is a very clear pattern of eastern forest birds expanding their ranges westward into the Great Plains. A few are decidedly not expanding, such as the two goatsucker species. The driving factors or drivers may include aspects of climate change, aspects of afforestation and land use change, and then an artifactual driver of simply increasing sampling. And more than anything, quite a bit more work left to do. But again, Fernando and I would very much appreciate any input and any thoughts about this. And we will be doing more and more detailed analysis of the data to try to pick out patterns more generally. And again, we'd very much appreciate any feedback that you might give us, and hope this has been interesting to you. Thanks very much.
Wow.
All right.
Cool. I've got the email in the chat there.
Yeah, so as Town said, if you have any more information or questions or are able to help, get a hold of him. And I will make note briefly that you guys all have ways to contact all of our presenters today. One of the things that's really tough, I think, for any of that research is getting funding. So if you have any interest in helping any of these people, get a hold of them and see how you can help with this research, because this was all very, very cool research that's going on. So a lot of interesting presentations to watch today. And there were 6, did we have 6 students? I think.
Out of the 11?
Yeah.
You probably know better, but yeah.
I think so. Anyways, they were in the categories of either a doctorate candidate or a master's student. And they were up for an award through KOS. And we had a panel of judges that were able to judge their presentations that they submitted. And this evening at our 7 p.m. Event, they will be announcing that. John Shuckman should be available to announce that. So make sure you guys join us later for that. And we just want to thank all of our presenters for submitting these, and especially during this interesting time we live in.
Absolutely. So what's going on next for our KOS Fall Meeting weekend, Jen, that people need to be aware of?
Yeah, so if you registered, then tonight at 7 p.m. we will be hosting a little happy hour. And like I said, that's when we will announce our student award winners for the presentations. So, and if you've been birding this weekend, we hope that you'll share some of the fun stuff you've seen this weekend. So 7 o'clock, and you should have emails from me to enter that Zoom meeting.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in to our watch party. If you want to keep talking to the researchers, you know how to get a hold of them, I think. And we also have the playlist of all the videos on the KOS YouTube channel, so you can find all of them. And yeah, a serious thank you to the presenters who were here today too, to live interact with people. That was so cool. Malcolm just posted that.
Yes.
But yeah, okay. Anything else?
All right. I think that's it. So thanks again for joining us today.
Bye, guys.
See ya.